In the bitter cold of January 1859, nestled within the secluded valleys of Western Virginia, a discovery was made that would shake the medical establishment to its very core. 4 identical infants, perfect quadruplets, were found alive but severely malnourished in an abandoned doctor's residence, surrounded by medical journals documenting their existence as specimens rather than human beings. The physician responsible, known in medical circles as Dr. Elias Blackwood, had vanished without a trace, leaving behind evidence of experiments so disturbing that 3 local doctors who examined the records refused to ever practice medicine again. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. What makes this case truly haunting isn't just the horrific treatment of the identical children, but the chilling realization that Dr. Blackwood had been conducting his twisted research with the knowledge and even funding from some of America's most prestigious medical institutions. The quadruplets called him father, but the truth behind that title would prove far more sinister than anyone could have imagined. Before we continue with the story of the Blackwood quadruplets and their unspeakable ordeal, I want to ask you something important. This channel isn't for everyone, only for the bravest souls who dare to confront the darkest chapters of American medical history. If you've made it this far, you're not like most people. You understand that some truths are too horrifying to ignore, no matter how much they disturb us. So hit that subscribe button and join our community of true mystery seekers. And tell me in the comments, what state are you listening from? Are you brave enough to hear stories like this from your own backyard? The question that haunted investigators then and continues to perplex medical historians today is how such a macabre experiment could have been conducted with no intervention for nearly 5 years in a time when rural communities noticed every small change in their surroundings. The Virginia of 1859 was a state precariously balanced between 2 worlds. The traditional plantation economy still dominated, while northern industrialization and scientific advancement created a new class of educated professionals who pushed the boundaries of knowledge, sometimes at terrible human cost. In this environment, the small town of Crescent Hill, a collection of perhaps 60 families spread across the gentle slopes of Augusta County, represented the typical southern rural settlement of the era. Most residents farmed wheat or tobacco, traded at Richardson's General Store, and gathered for social events at the white-painted church that anchored the community square. The medical practice of Dr. Elias Blackwood sat on the outskirts of this community, a handsome 2-story brick home with an attached office where he treated patients 3 days each week. To any traveler passing along the dusty road that connected Crescent Hill to Staunton, Dr. Blackwood's residence appeared to be the home of a respectable country physician. The house itself, built in the Greek Revival style popular during the 1840s, featured imposing white columns and large windows that flooded the interior with natural light. A modest carriage house stood behind the main structure, along with a small garden where medicinal herbs were cultivated. What made the Blackwood property unique wasn't visible from the road. Dr. Blackwood, who had established his practice in Crescent Hill in 1854, after completing his medical education at Jefferson Medical College in Philadelphia, had modified the home's upper floor into what he called his research sanctuary. While most country doctors maintained simple examination rooms, Blackwood had invested considerable resources in creating a sophisticated suite of rooms dedicated to what he described to the occasional visitor as advancing medical understanding of human development. Local craftsmen remembered being hired to install special ventilation systems, reinforce floors for heavy equipment, and construct custom cabinetry throughout the 2nd story. None had seen the completed work, as Blackwood supervised each project separately and allowed no worker to see the entire layout. He paid generously in gold coins, requesting only that the workers focus on their assigned tasks rather than questioning the overall purpose. Martha Blackwood, Elias's wife, had arrived in Crescent Hill in 1855 as a bride of 26. Neighbors remembered her as a slender woman with auburn hair and unusually quiet demeanor. She dressed in the fashionable styles of northern cities, attended Episcopal services when her husband permitted, and maintained a reputation for being educated beyond the normal expectations for rural women. When approached about participating in community activities, Martha would inevitably explain that her health was delicate and that she devoted her limited energy to assisting her husband's important medical research. This explanation satisfied the community's curiosity about why Mrs. Blackwood rarely left the property, and why she never participated in the social gatherings that formed the backbone of rural Virginia society. The arrangement, she explained during her infrequent appearances in town, was temporary until Dr. Blackwood completed his research project, and they could return to Philadelphia where she had family connections. Mrs. Henderson, who ran the millinery shop adjacent to her husband's general store, would sometimes notice Martha Blackwood's nervous glances toward the upper windows of their home when she came to town for supplies. When questioned about her obvious anxiety, Martha would explain that she worried about leaving her husband's papers unattended, as his research was of national importance and required absolute secrecy. The community, impressed by having a Philadelphia-educated physician in their midst and familiar with the mysterious nature of medical research, accepted these explanations without serious question. Thomas Richardson, who operated the general store, later recalled that Dr. Blackwood was one of his most peculiar customers. Unlike most residents who purchase supplies as needed, Blackwood would submit precise written orders at the beginning of each month, with specific instructions about delivery times and the requirement that goods be left at the back entrance rather than brought into the house. The orders always included unusual quantities of milk, eggs, and other nutritious foods, far more than a childless couple would require. When Thomas once mentioned this, Dr. Blackwood explained that proper nutrition was essential to his health and that of his wife, particularly given the demanding nature of his research. He also regularly purchased significant quantities of medical supplies, specialized chemicals from European manufacturers, and books from publishers in Boston, New York, and Philadelphia. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The Blackwood household operated on a schedule that puzzled some neighbors. While most families maintained predictable routines, the activities at the Blackwood residence seemed to follow no pattern discernible to outside observers. Lights could be seen moving from room to room at all hours of the night, and strange sounds, sometimes described as mechanical whirring, sometimes as muffled crying, occasionally carried across the night air to nearby properties. When questioned about these peculiarities, Dr. Blackwood would explain that medical research followed no civilized schedule and that breakthroughs often came at the most unexpected hours. His dedication to science, he reminded anyone who asked too many questions, was the reason the community had access to the most modern medical techniques, rather than the primitive treatments still common in most rural areas. Dr. Samuel Jenkins, the elderly physician who served the neighboring community of Pine Ridge, remembered being invited to the Blackwood residence exactly once during the 5 years his colleague lived in the area. The invitation, extended shortly after Blackwood's arrival, was for a dinner to discuss potential collaboration. Jenkins described the evening as uncomfortable, with Blackwood dominating the conversation with theories about human development that Jenkins found disturbing and ethically questionable. He spoke of children as though they were nothing more than biological specimens, Jenkins later testified. When I suggested that his proposals crossed the boundaries of proper medical ethics, he became coldly dismissive, suggesting that true scientific advancement required moving beyond what he called sentimental attachments to traditional morality. Jenkins was never invited back, and Blackwood thereafter referred critical patients to doctors in Staunton rather than consulting with his local colleague. What none of the community members realized was that Dr. Elias Blackwood had been perfecting a deception of extraordinary complexity for nearly 5 years. Behind the facade of legitimate medical research, he was conducting experiments that violated every principle of human dignity and medical ethics. The true nature of his work would only become clear in the bitter January of 1859, when a series of coincidences finally exposed what had been happening in the rooms above his respectable medical practice. The most puzzling aspect of the Blackwood case, both then and now, was the source of the quadruplets. No record of their birth existed in Augusta County or any surrounding communities. No family had reported identical quadruplets missing, an event so rare it would have created newspaper headlines across the country. The children seemed to have appeared from nowhere, their existence known only to Blackwood and his wife. The investigation would eventually reveal that Blackwood had connections to several lying-in hospitals in Philadelphia, including one that specialized in caring for unwed mothers from wealthy families who wished to deliver their babies in absolute secrecy. The birth of identical quadruplets to a young woman from a prominent Boston family had been seen by Blackwood not as a medical miracle to be celebrated, but as an unprecedented research opportunity. 4 identical human subjects, perfectly matched, for his studies of nature versus nurture, pain response, and developmental manipulation. The young mother had been told that her babies died shortly after birth, a common enough occurrence that no questions were asked, particularly given the extreme rarity and high mortality rate of quadruplet births in the mid-19th century. Medical records indicated that she herself died of complications several days later, though investigators would later question whether her death had been natural or induced to eliminate the only person who knew of the quadruplets' existence. Blackwood had transported the newborn infants to Virginia in a specially constructed carrier that maintained warmth during the winter journey. His research journals, later discovered in a hidden compartment beneath his desk, documented their arrival at his Crescent Hill residence when they were less than 2 weeks old. He had named them Alpha, Beta, Gamma, and Delta, deliberately avoiding proper names to maintain what he called scientific detachment from the research subjects. The journals revealed a methodical plan of experimentation that would unfold over at least 15 years, culminating in what Blackwood described as definitive answers to the fundamental questions of human development. The early entries documented careful measurements of physical characteristics, cognitive development, and sensory responses. As the children grew, the experiments became increasingly invasive and disturbing. Martha Blackwood's role in this horrific scenario remained ambiguous throughout the investigation. Some journal entries suggested she had initially believed her husband's claim that the quadruplets were orphans, being temporarily housed as part of a legitimate research project sponsored by his medical colleagues in Philadelphia. Other evidence indicated that as the true nature of her husband's work became clear, she had suffered a psychological collapse that rendered her increasingly detached from reality. The discovery that would expose Dr. Blackwood's macabre research began with a winter storm of historic proportions. January 1859 brought the most severe blizzard in living memory to Western Virginia, with temperatures dropping well below zero and snow accumulating to depths that made roads impassable for weeks. The bitter cold that gripped the region would prove to be both a torment and salvation for the 4 children imprisoned in the upper rooms of the Blackwood house. On January 14, 1859, a traveling book peddler named Frederick Wilson was caught in the blizzard while making his way from Staunton to Lexington. With his horse struggling through snowdrifts and darkness falling rapidly, the Blackwood house was the only shelter visible through the swirling snow. Despite its isolated location, Wilson had no choice but to request emergency accommodation. Dr. Blackwood, clearly agitated by the unexpected visitor, reluctantly allowed Wilson to stable. his horse in the carriage house, and offered him a place to sleep in the medical examination room. He explained that his wife was severely ill and that the rest of the house was under quarantine due to risk of infection. Wilson would be required to leave at first light, regardless of weather conditions. What disturbed Wilson most about that night was not the cold or his host's obvious reluctance to provide shelter, but the sounds he heard through the ceiling above his makeshift bed. Throughout the night, as the wind howled around the house, he could distinguish the sounds of several children crying, their voices occasionally rising in what seemed to be pain or terror. When he mentioned these sounds to Dr. Blackwood over a tense breakfast, the doctor explained that he was treating several children from a nearby tenant farm for frostbite and pneumonia. Their families, he claimed, had been unable to reach town due to the storm. Wilson accepted this explanation. But something about Blackwood's manner, a nervousness that seemed excessive even given the circumstances, left him uneasy. As he prepared to depart, despite the continuing storm, he noticed that Martha Blackwood was watching him from an upstairs window, her expression suggesting she wanted to communicate something urgent. When Wilson raised his hand in farewell, she pressed her palm against the glass in a gesture that seemed more plea than goodbye. The second incident occurred 3 days later, when the storm had finally subsided enough for travel to resume. James Campbell, who delivered mail between Staunton and outlying communities, made his first rounds after the blizzard and found an unusual pile of correspondence that had accumulated for Dr. Blackwood. Among the letters were several from prestigious medical institutions, including Harvard Medical School and the Philadelphia Academy of Medicine. What caught Campbell's attention, however, was a small package that had broken open during transport, revealing several vials of chemicals and a letter on the stationery of a pharmaceutical supplier in Baltimore. The letter referenced a previous order and inquired whether the experimental protocol with subjects A through D has yielded the expected results. Campbell, whose son had been treated by Blackwood for a broken arm the previous summer, found the wording strange enough to mention to Sheriff Thomas Miller when he returned to Staunton. The final incident that triggered a formal investigation came on January 22nd, when Martha Blackwood herself appeared at the Richardson General Store in a state of extreme distress. Her clothes were inadequate for the bitter weather she wore. No coat despite temperatures well below freezing, and her behavior suggested severe mental agitation. She purchased large quantities of milk, bread, and simple foods that required no preparation, paying with coins rather than the usual account arrangement. When Mrs. Richardson expressed concern about her condition, Martha became increasingly distraught, eventually collapsing into tears and making a series of disturbing statements about the children, and how he won't feed them properly, and that they cry all night now. When Thomas Richardson offered to fetch Dr. Blackwood, Martha became hysterical, insisting that no one tell her husband where she was or what she had said. The Richardsons, deeply concerned, allowed her to leave with her purchases but immediately sent their oldest son to notify Sheriff Miller about the troubling incident. Sheriff Thomas Miller, a cautious man who had served Augusta County for over a decade, initially approached the situation with skepticism. Mrs. Blackwood was known to be delicate, perhaps suffering from what physicians of the era called nervous exhaustion. Her behavior, while concerning, might simply reflect the strain of isolation during the recent storm. Nevertheless, his position required him to investigate any suggestion of potential harm to children. On the morning of January 24th, Sheriff Miller rode out to the Blackwood residence, accompanied by his deputy William Parker. They arrived just after 9 o'clock, expecting to find the doctor preparing for his regular Monday consultations. Instead, they discovered the front door standing open, despite the bitter cold, and no response to their repeated knocks and calls. The scene inside the house immediately suggested something was seriously wrong. The normally meticulous front office was in disarray, with medical books scattered across the floor and patient records spilled from their cabinet. More concerning was the smell, a combination of unwashed bodies, waste, and the sickly sweet odor that experienced lawmen recognized as associated with severe illness or approaching death. As Miller and Parker moved cautiously through the ground floor, they found further signs of disturbance but no occupants. It was only when they climbed the stairs to the second floor that they began to understand they were dealing with something far outside their previous experience. The upper story had been converted into what could only be described as a laboratory, with rooms filled with equipment more suited to a major medical college than a country doctor's residence. In the largest room, facing the back of the property, where it would not be visible from the road, they found them 4 identical children, approximately 5 years old, confined to what appeared to be specially constructed cribs with measuring devices attached to the frames. The children were severely malnourished, with identical faces gaunt from hunger and identical eyes wide with fear. They made no sound as the strangers entered, watching in silence with expressions that Deputy Parker would later describe as containing no childhood at all, only a terrible waiting. The physical condition of the quadruplets shocked even Sheriff Miller, who had seen the aftermath of battlefield wounds during his military service. Despite being obviously identical in their features, the children showed different developmental patterns, suggesting deliberate manipulation of their growth and abilities. Most disturbing to the officers was the children's behavior. They did not speak, cry, or reach out for comfort when approached. They watched the men with wary expressions but made no attempt to communicate. When Deputy Parker offered one child a drink of water, the boy took the cup with trembling hands but waited, watching his identical siblings until Parker had offered water to all 4. Only then did they drink, in perfect unison, each taking exactly the same number of sips before carefully setting the cups down. In a smaller adjoining room, the officers found Martha Blackwood curled on a narrow bed, unresponsive to their questions or attempts to rouse her. She appeared to be in a catatonic state, her eyes open but unseeing, her body rigid except for a slight rocking motion. Of Dr. Elias Blackwood, there was no sign. The documentation found in Blackwood's private study would provide the most damning evidence of what had been happening in the isolated house. Meticulously organized journals recorded 5 years of systematic experimentation on the quadruplets, beginning from their first days of life. The earliest entries documented basic measurements and observations, but as the children grew, the experiments became increasingly invasive. Blackwood had been conducting what he called comparative development studies, deliberately altering the conditions under which each child was raised while maintaining precise records of the differences that emerged. Alpha, designated as the control subject, received adequate nutrition and basic care, but no stimulation or affection. Beta was systematically underfed to study the effects of malnutrition on development. Gamma received enhanced nutrition but was kept in partial darkness to study sensory adaptation. Delta was subjected to regular pain stimuli to measure the development of pain tolerance and response. The journals revealed that Blackwood viewed the identical quadruplets as the perfect research opportunity for genetically identical subjects who could be modified through environmental manipulation. His notes referred repeatedly to the advancement of medical science and knowledge that will benefit generations, phrases that stood in stark contrast to the clinical descriptions of suffering he inflicted on the children. Most damning were the letters found in a locked drawer of his desk. Correspondence with prominent physicians at several prestigious medical institutions revealed that Blackwood's research was not only known to others in the medical establishment, but was actually being funded through private grants. Several letters congratulated him on the unique opportunity represented by the quadruplets and requested regular reports on his findings. None expressed concern about the ethical implications or questioned the source of his research subjects. The discovery at the Blackwood residence sent shock waves through Augusta County and eventually across the entire country as newspapers reported the horrific details. The community of Crescent Hill which had accepted the physician's eccentricities. Without question, now grappled with its collective failure to recognize what had been happening in their midst. How had no one noticed? How had no one asked the right questions? The answers lay partly in Blackwood's careful cultivation of his professional reputation and partly in the community's deference to medical authority. Thomas Richardson, recalling the unusual purchasing patterns he had observed over the years, was haunted by his failure to connect the obvious signs. He bought supplies for 4 children, regular as clockwork, Richardson later testified. 4 of everything, always identical items, always the minimal amounts needed for survival. I thought it strange, but who questions a doctor about his household? Dr. Samuel Jenkins blamed himself for not pursuing his early concerns about Blackwood's ethical views. He spoke of advancing medical knowledge through methods that conventional ethics wouldn't permit, Jenkins recalled. I was disturbed, but told myself it was merely theoretical discussion. I never imagined he would or could actually implement such ideas. The immediate challenge facing Sheriff Miller was the care of the Quadruplets and the catatonic Martha Blackwood. The children required urgent medical attention, but their reaction to Dr. Jenkins when he arrived to examine them made it clear that they associated all medical professionals with pain and fear. They retreated to the corners of their cribs, identical. Expressions of terror on their identical faces when Jenkins attempted to approach them. It was Sarah Miller, the sheriff's wife, who eventually found a way to reach the children. Arriving with clean clothes and fresh food, she approached them. Not as patients or victims, but simply as children. She sat on the floor near their cribs, eating a slice of apple herself before offering pieces to them. She spoke quietly, telling them simple stories about her own children, never demanding response or even attention. After nearly 2 hours, one of the quadruplets, later identified as Gamma, extended a thin hand toward her, not to take food but simply to touch her arm, as if confirming she was real. That small gesture of trust was the beginning of what would become the most challenging rehabilitation effort in Virginia medical history. The quadruplets, who had never been given proper names, were temporarily designated by the letters Blackwood, had assigned them until they could choose names for themselves. Their physical recovery began quickly once they received proper nutrition and medical care, but their psychological and developmental issues proved far more challenging. As news of the discovery spread, the search for Dr. Elias Blackwood intensified. Evidence suggested he had fled immediately after Martha's troubling visit to the general store, taking with him only his research journals and a substantial amount of gold coins from a safe hidden behind a medical bookcase. Initial searches focused on the stagecoach routes to Richmond and Washington, but investigations would eventually reveal that Blackwood had anticipated the potential discovery of his research for months and had prepared an elaborate escape route. The financial investigation uncovered a network of bank accounts in Boston, New York, and Philadelphia, all connected to Blackwood's research. Funds had been regularly deposited by several prominent physicians and medical institutions, with transactions disguised as payments for consulting services or research materials. The total amount involved was staggering for the time. Over $30,000 had passed through these accounts over 5 years, equivalent to nearly $1 million in modern currency. The most disturbing financial discovery was a contract found among Blackwood's papers, signed by representatives of 3 medical schools, granting them exclusive rights to the research findings, preserved specimens, and all biological materials resulting from the quadruplet studies. The contract included a schedule of planned procedures extending well into the children's adolescence, with specific anatomical studies to be conducted at designated developmental stages. The clinical language could not disguise the horrifying implication: the quadruplets had never been expected to reach adulthood. As the investigation expanded beyond Augusta County, the case began to reveal disturbing connections within the highest levels of American medical education. Letters and financial records showed that at least 17 prominent physicians had knowledge of Blackwood's research, with several actively participating through correspondence and specific experimental suggestions. None had questioned the ethics of experimenting on children or the suspicious circumstances surrounding the acquisition of identical quadruplets. The press coverage of the case created a national scandal that forced the medical establishment to confront its ethical failures. Newspaper editorials demanded to know how respected institutions could have supported such research, even indirectly. Medical journals, initially reluctant to address the case, eventually published scathing critiques of the ethical blindness that had allowed Blackwood's research to continue for years with institutional support. For the quadruplets themselves, the path forward was uncertain. Having never known any existence beyond their confined research environment, they faced challenges that no medical or psychological expert of the time was fully equipped to address. They spoke a limited language that combined elements of standard English with a private communication system they had developed among themselves. They had no concept of family, community, or normal childhood experiences. They remained deeply bonded to each other while struggling to form connections with anyone else. The first major breakthrough in their recovery came nearly 6 weeks after their rescue, when Alpha, who had been designated as Blackwood's control subject, spoke directly to Sarah Miller for the first time. "Are we still for the medicine?" he asked in a halting voice. The question revealed the children's fundamental understanding of their own existence. They believed they had been created solely for medical research, with no other purpose or value. Sarah's tearful response, "No, dear one. You are for yourselves now," began the quadruplets' long journey toward understanding their own humanity. The concept that they existed for their own sake, not as research subjects or medical specimens, was so foreign to them that it took months of gentle repetition before they began to internalize this fundamental truth. While the children were beginning their recovery, the hunt for Dr. Elias Blackwood continued across multiple states. Sightings were reported from Richmond to Boston, but the physician had clearly planned his disappearance with the same methodical attention to detail that had characterized his research. He had abandoned his wife without hesitation, taking only what he considered valuable: his research data and financial resources. Martha Blackwood, meanwhile, remained in a state that modern psychiatrists would recognize as severe dissociative disorder. Placed under the care of Dr. Elizabeth Harwood, one of the few female physicians practicing in Virginia at that time, she occasionally emerged from her catatonic state long enough to provide fragmentary information about the years at Crescent Hill. Her lucid moments revealed a woman who had initially been deceived about the nature of her husband's work and then psychologically broken when she discovered the truth. "He told me they were orphans," she whispered during one brief period of clarity. "Special children for a special study. By the time I understood, it was too late. He said no one would believe me, that his colleagues would protect him, that I would be declared insane if I spoke out." The moments of lucidity never lasted long, with Martha retreating back into unresponsiveness when pressed for details that might help locate her husband. The medical establishment's initial response to the Blackwood case was a defensive attempt to distance itself from the scandal. Official statements from medical schools mentioned in Blackwood's correspondence denied any knowledge of unethical research, describing their financial support as intended for theoretical studies rather than actual experimentation. These denials became impossible to maintain as more evidence emerged, including detailed letters acknowledging receipt of progress reports that clearly described invasive procedures performed on the children. The breakthrough in tracking Blackwood came from an unexpected source. A porter at a small Philadelphia hotel recognized his picture in a newspaper and reported that a man matching his description had stayed at the establishment 3 weeks earlier, paying in gold coins and departing on a ship bound for Liverpool. Maritime records confirmed that a passenger traveling under the name Edward Bennett had booked passage to England just days after Blackwood's disappearance from Virginia. The investigation now expanded internationally, with American diplomatic representatives in Britain joining the search. Victorian England, with its network of prestigious medical institutions and private research facilities, offered numerous potential havens for a physician with Blackwood's credentials and financial resources. The trail led from Liverpool to London, and eventually to Edinburgh, where the renowned medical school had a history of pushing ethical boundaries in the name of scientific advancement. Meanwhile, back in Virginia, the quadruplets were facing the next phase of their recovery, the development of individual identities. Having been treated as interchangeable research subjects for 5 years, they struggled to understand themselves as separate individuals. The turning point came when Sarah Miller brought 4 different colored blankets to their shared room, allowing each child to select one. After long deliberation and silent communication among themselves, each selected a different color, a small but significant step toward individual identity. The blue blanket was chosen by the child designated Alpha, who would eventually choose the name Samuel. The red went to Beta, later named Thomas. The green was selected by Gamma, who would become James, and the yellow blanket was embraced by Delta, eventually known as William. These color preferences became their first expression of individual choice after years of enforced uniformity. The quadruplets' transition from research subjects to individual children required extraordinary patience from their caregivers. The community of Crescent Hill, determined to atone for its failure to recognize what had happened in their midst, rallied around the children with remarkable dedication. Local families donated clothing, toys, and books. The Richardsons converted their home's spare bedroom into a special learning space where the boys could begin to experience normal childhood activities in a safe environment. Dr. Elizabeth Harwood, who had taken charge of both the children's physical recovery and Martha Blackwood's treatment, developed an innovative approach that combined medical care with what we would now recognize as early psychological therapy, rather than separating the quadruplets, who became severely distressed. When apart, she worked with their intense bond, using it as a foundation for their healing. The connection between these children is both their greatest vulnerability and their greatest strength. Dr. Harwood wrote in her medical journal, "They experience trauma as a unit, and they must heal as a unit before they can begin to develop as individuals." Her approach was revolutionary for the time, when most physicians would have prescribed separation to break their unhealthy dependence on each other. The first major medical challenge emerged when Samuel, formerly Alpha, developed pneumonia. In March 1859, the illness, likely a consequence of his years of confinement, quickly became life-threatening. What fascinated Dr. Harwood was the simultaneous appearance of milder respiratory symptoms in the other 3 boys, despite no evidence of contagion. They developed low fevers, coughs, and chest congestion that mirrored Samuel's more serious condition, as if their bodies were expressing sympathy with their brother's illness. Even more remarkable was their response to treatment. Dr. Harwood initially treated only Samuel with the standard remedies of the time mustard plasters, steam inhalation, and herbal expectorants. To her astonishment, all 4 boys showed improvement, though only Samuel had received medication. This pattern of shared symptoms and shared recovery would repeat itself throughout their rehabilitation, challenging the medical understanding of the time and suggesting connections between the quadruplets that transcended ordinary human experience. The investigation into Dr. Blackwood's medical connections continued to uncover disturbing evidence of institutional complicity. Financial records revealed that his research had been funded through a complex network of payments from 5 major medical schools and 7 prominent physicians, all disguised as legitimate professional transactions. The total funding amounted to over $45,000 over 5 years, an enormous sum that reflected the value the medical establishment placed on his unprecedented access to identical quadruplets. The most damning evidence came from correspondence found in a hidden compartment in Blackwood's writing desk. Letters from Dr. Harold Whitcomb, Dean of Medicine at Harrington Medical College in Philadelphia, explicitly acknowledged the unethical nature of the research while encouraging its continuation. The questions you are answering through your unique methodology could never be addressed through conventional research approaches, Whitcomb wrote. While I cannot officially endorse your methods, I recognize that medical advancement sometimes requires moving beyond the boundaries of current ethical thinking. Other letters revealed that at least 3 prominent physicians had actually visited the Crescent Hill residence to observe the quadruplets firsthand. Their clinical notes, cold and detached, described the children as remarkably responsive experimental subjects and commended Blackwood on his meticulous control of variables. None expressed concern about the obvious suffering of the children or questioned the morality of the experiments. The revelation of this wider conspiracy created a national scandal that reached the highest levels of American medicine. Congressional hearings were convened to investigate the ethical failures that had allowed such research to continue with institutional support. Medical schools implicated in the funding struggled to explain their involvement, with several administrators resigning in disgrace as public outrage mounted. The search for Dr. Blackwood took an unexpected turn in April 1859 when British authorities reported that the fugitive physician had been traced to a private research facility near Edinburgh but had escaped just hours before his planned arrest. Evidence found at the site suggested he had been preparing to establish a new research program with the support of several Scottish physicians who were unaware of his criminal background. The international hunt continued, with sightings reported from Switzerland, Austria, and finally Russia, where the trail went cold. The expanding investigation revealed that Blackwood had established connections with medical researchers across Europe during his years in Virginia, cultivating relationships through correspondence and shared research interests that now provided him with potential safe havens beyond American jurisdiction. Back in Virginia, the quadruplets continued their remarkable journey toward recovery. By summer 1859, all 4 boys had begun speaking more freely, though they still relied heavily on their private communication system when discussing emotional topics. They had begun to express individual preferences in food, activities, and clothing, though they remained most comfortable when dressed similarly. The most significant breakthrough came in June, when William, formerly Delta, who had endured the most severe experimental procedures, spoke about his experiences for the first time. During a quiet evening, as Sarah Miller read to the boys from a children's book, William suddenly said, "Father hurt us to make the medicine better." This simple statement opened the door to their first discussions of what had happened to them. The accounts that emerged over subsequent weeks painted a picture of systematic torture disguised as medical research. The boys described how they had been subjected to deliberately contrasting treatments, different foods, different exposures, to light and sound, different physical manipulations, all while being measured, weighed, and tested constantly. They remembered being displayed to visiting doctors who examined them like prized specimens. Most disturbingly, they described surgical procedures performed without adequate pain management, tissue samples taken from matching locations on their bodies, and endless rounds of injections, withdrawals of blood, and other invasive procedures. These revelations, carefully documented by Dr. Harwood, became crucial evidence in the expanding investigation. The children's accounts matched the clinical records found in Blackwood's journals, confirming that the research had been even more extensive and invasive than initially believed. Their testimony, limited though it was by their developmental delays and emotional trauma, provided the human reality behind the clinical documentation. Martha Blackwood's condition, meanwhile, showed minimal improvement. She remained largely unresponsive, emerging from her catatonic state only for brief periods, during which she typically spoke about her early marriage rather than the years in Crescent Hill, Dr. Harwood diagnosed her condition as protective disassociation, her mind's desperate attempt to shield itself from memories too painful to confront. During one rare moment of clarity in July, Martha provided a crucial piece of information about her husband's research. "It wasn't just the four," she whispered to Dr. Harwood. "There were others before, in Philadelphia. Single children, twins. Once, they didn't survive his methods. The quadruplets were his perfect opportunity. 3 experimental subjects and 1 control, all identical from birth." This revelation expanded the investigation yet again, with authorities in Philadelphia exhuming records from the lying-in hospital where Blackwood had worked before moving to Virginia. The hospital records, incomplete and poorly maintained, nonetheless suggested that at least 7 other children had died under suspicious circumstances while under Blackwood's care. All had been born to unwed mothers from wealthy families, their births and deaths recorded with minimal documentation. By late summer 1859, the quadruplets had progressed enough in their recovery to begin limited interaction with other children. The first such encounter, carefully arranged with the Richardson children who had been prepared for the meeting, revealed both progress and continuing challenges. The quadruplets remained physically close to each other, communicating through glances and subtle gestures before engaging with the other children. They struggled with normal play activities, unfamiliar with even the simplest games, but showed eager curiosity about everything the Richardson children demonstrated. What struck observers most forcefully was the quadruplets' response to minor injuries during play. When Thomas scraped his knee after attempting to climb a low tree branch, all 4 boys stopped immediately, gathered around the injury, and examined it with clinical detachment. "Data point," Samuel said matter-of-factly, using terminology they had heard throughout their confinement. They seemed genuinely confused when Mrs. Richardson applied a soothing salve and offered comfort rather than documenting the injury as a research observation. This incident highlighted the enormous challenge facing their caregivers. The boys had spent their entire conscious lives as research subjects, their experiences of pain and injury always framed as data rather than occasions for comfort or care. Teaching them that injuries were not valuable data points, but experiences that warranted sympathy and treatment, required a fundamental reshaping of their understanding of human interaction. As fall approached, the international search for Dr. Blackwood yielded another tantalizing lead. A physician matching his description had secured a position at a remote research facility in the Russian countryside near Moscow, where medical experimentation faced few legal or ethical constraints. The American ambassador to Russia requested assistance from Russian authorities, but the wheels of international justice turned slowly, complicated by diplomatic tensions and the approaching winter that would make travel to remote areas impossible until spring. The investigation within American medical institutions continued to uncover disturbing evidence of systemic ethical failures. Beyond the specific case of the quadruplets, investigators discovered numerous other instances where research had proceeded without proper consent or oversight, particularly when subjects were drawn from vulnerable populations, the poor, the mentally ill, and those without family connections to protect their interests. The Blackwood case became a catalyst for the first serious national discussion of medical ethics and research oversight in American history. Medical journals that had initially defended the advancement of knowledge at any cost began publishing thoughtful examinations of the boundaries between legitimate research and exploitation. Medical schools, fearing public backlash and potential legal consequences, began establishing formal ethical guidelines for research involving human subjects. For the quadruplets, now approaching their 6th birthday, though the exact date remained unknown, each day brought new discoveries about the normal world that had been denied to them. Simple experiences feeling rain on their faces, petting a dog, tasting fresh fruit produced reactions of wonder and confusion. They approached these experiences with a combination of scientific curiosity and childlike joy, often taking turns to try something new and then comparing detailed notes on their sensations. Their individual personalities began to emerge more clearly as recovery continued. Samuel, the control subject who had received the most consistent care during confinement, showed natural leadership abilities and often spoke for the group. Thomas, who had been systematically malnourished, developed an intense interest in food and cooking, spending hours observing Mrs. Richardson in the kitchen. James, who had been kept in partial darkness, showed extraordinary sensitivity to visual beauty, particularly colors and patterns. William, who had endured regular pain stimuli, revealed both the deepest emotional wounds and the strongest drive to protect his brothers from any perceived threat. The medical establishment's reckoning with the Blackwood case intensified when a group of reform-minded physicians published the Blackwood Report in October 1859. The document provided a comprehensive analysis of how respected medical institutions had facilitated unethical research through funding, professional validation, and deliberate blindness to questionable methods. The report named 23 prominent physicians who had direct knowledge of the quadruplet experiments, including several who held leadership positions in America's most prestigious medical schools. The public response was immediate and powerful. State legislatures across the country began drafting laws to regulate medical research and protect vulnerable populations from exploitation. Medical schools faced unprecedented scrutiny, with several temporarily losing their accreditation pending implementation of ethical oversight mechanisms. The American Medical Association, which had initially remained silent on the Blackwood case, finally issued a formal condemnation and began developing the first nationwide code of medical ethics. The most significant legal development came in November 1859, when the Virginia legislature passed what became known as the Quadruplet Protection Act, the first American law specifically designed to prevent medical experimentation on children. The law established criminal penalties for conducting research on minors without parental consent and created oversight committees to monitor all medical research involving human subjects. Similar legislation would eventually be adopted by 12 other states, creating the foundation for modern research ethics regulations. As winter returned to Virginia, bringing back memories of the blizzard that had led to their discovery, the quadruplets faced new challenges in their recovery. The anniversary of their rescue triggered regression in all four boys' nightmares, renewed silence, and intensified dependency on each other. Dr. Harwood, recognizing the connection between the cold weather and their traumatic memories, worked with the community to create positive winter experiences that might help override the negative associations. The first snowfall brought a particularly difficult day, with all four boys retreating to corners of their room, huddled together, and refusing to speak. Sarah Miller, who had become their primary caregiver, recognized that forcing them to confront the snow might only deepen their trauma. Instead, she brought the snow inside, placing a small amount in a bowl and adding drops of colored water to create a simple sensory experience they could explore in safety. This gentle introduction, allowing the boys to approach the triggering material on their own terms, became a model for helping them process other traumatic memories. By Christmas 1859, the quadruplets had progressed enough to participate in limited community celebrations. The sight of the four identical boys, dressed in their Sunday best with only differently colored neckties to distinguish them, created a sensation at the Crescent Hill Church service. Community members who had followed their recovery from a distance were struck by both how far they had come and how much their experiences had marked them. They stood together, physically connected by touch at all times, their expressions serious, as they observed the festive activities with scientific attention to detail. The holiday also brought an unexpected development in the search for Dr. Blackwood. A package arrived at the sheriff's office in Augusta County, postmarked from St. Petersburg, Russia, containing a lengthy manuscript entitled Medical Observations on Genetically Identical Subjects, 5 years of controlled study. The accompanying letter, signed by Blackwood himself, explained that he was submitting his research for publication in American medical journals, confident that the scientific value of his work would eventually overshadow what he dismissed as sentimental objections to necessary research methodologies. The manuscript revealed the full scope of Blackwood's delusional self-justification. He portrayed himself as a medical pioneer whose work had been misunderstood by those lacking scientific vision. He described the quadruplets not as victims, but as fortunate contributors to medical advancement, whose suffering would benefit humanity for generations. Most disturbingly, he outlined plans for continued research on multiple births, requesting correspondence from colleagues who might identify suitable subjects for his continuing studies. The Russian authorities, provided with this new evidence of Blackwood's location, finally moved to apprehend him. On January 10, 1860, almost exactly 1 year after the quadruplets' rescue, Dr. Elias Blackwood was arrested at a small research facility outside St. Petersburg. The facility, investigators discovered, had already obtained twin infants from a local orphanage for what was described as developmental research. The intervention had come just in time to prevent Blackwood from establishing a new operation similar to his Virginia research. The international negotiations for Blackwood's extradition began immediately, complicated by the absence of formal extradition treaties covering such unusual crimes. The Russian authorities, disturbed by the evidence found at his laboratory, committed to holding him until diplomatic arrangements could be completed. The American public, following developments through newspaper reports, demanded justice for the quadruplets and accountability for the physician who had tortured them in the name of science. As their second year of freedom began, the quadruplets demonstrated remarkable resilience alongside their continuing struggles. All 4 had begun receiving formal education, adapted to their unique needs by a retired schoolteacher who volunteered to work with them daily. Their intellectual development showed uneven patterns, advanced analytical abilities alongside significant gaps in basic knowledge and social understanding. Their progress was celebrated throughout the community. With each milestone, the first time William laughed spontaneously, the day James voluntarily separated from his brothers to examine a fascinating insect collection, Thomas's first attempt to help prepare a meal, Samuel's decision to sleep in his own bed rather than sharing with his brothers, recognized as a triumph over their traumatic past. Dr. Elizabeth Harwood, whose innovative treatment approaches had been central to their recovery, began publishing careful observations about their progress in medical journals, creating a new model for the ethical treatment and study of trauma in children. Her work, conducted with full transparency and the informed participation of the children's guardians, demonstrated how legitimate medical knowledge could be advanced without exploitation or harm. The contrast between Harwood's ethical approach and Blackwood's cruel experimentation became a powerful teaching tool in medical schools across the country. Students were presented with both methodologies and their outcomes, learning that scientific advancement need not come at the cost of human dignity, and that the most valuable medical knowledge emerges from healing rather than harm. In February 1860, Martha Blackwood died without ever fully emerging from her dissociative state. Her final days were peaceful, cared for by the same community that had embraced the quadruplets, but she never regained enough connection with reality to provide additional information about her husband's research or to find closure for her own role in the children's ordeal. Her funeral was simple, attended primarily by those who had cared for her during her illness rather than by friends or family. The question of the quadruplets' legal status and permanent guardianship became increasingly urgent as they continued to recover. They had no known biological family, their birth records had been falsified or destroyed, and their very existence remained something of a medical anomaly. After extensive deliberation, The Virginia courts created a special legal status for them as wards of the Commonwealth with specific protected status, essentially recognizing that their unique circumstances required innovative legal solutions. Sarah and Thomas Miller formally applied to become their permanent guardians, a position they had effectively held since the boys' rescue. The court proceedings included the unprecedented step of consulting the quadruplets themselves about their preferences, recognizing their right to participate in decisions about their future, despite their young age and unusual circumstances. The guardianship hearing in March 1860 marked another milestone in their journey toward normal life. Each boy spoke briefly to the judge, expressing in simple terms their wish to remain with the Millers and the community that had embraced them. The judge's decision, granting permanent guardianship to the Millers with continuing oversight from both medical and legal authorities, established a new precedent for considering the wishes of children in custody determinations. As spring returned to Virginia, bringing renewal to the landscape, the quadruplets continued their remarkable journey of recovery. They began spending more time outdoors, initially nervous in open spaces after years of confinement, but gradually developing a passionate interest in the natural world. Their scientific training, the one potentially positive legacy of their early experiences, gave them unusual observational skills that they now applied to butterflies, birds, and flowering plants rather than to their own suffering. The international legal proceedings against Dr. Blackwood finally concluded in April 1860, when Russian authorities agreed to extradite him to the United States to face trial for his crimes. The sea journey would take weeks, but the prospect of justice finally being served brought a sense of closure to the community that had been living with the shadow of his actions for nearly 18 months. For the quadruplets themselves, the news of Blackwood's impending return created mixed reactions. Their improved ability to express emotions allowed them to speak about their feelings toward Father for the first time. Their perspectives reflected their individual experiences under his care. Samuel expressed confusion about why a doctor would deliberately cause harm. Thomas spoke of hunger and neglect. James described the fear of darkness and isolation, and William, who had suffered the most direct abuse, remained silent on the subject, his feelings too complex for his developing emotional vocabulary. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.